to understand as we get into this. Not only will you give more, save more, and consume less, but the only group that does not apply to is those of you who have already saved so much you border on hoarding your money. Like you have amassed such an immense amount of wealth. Listen, you will not save more. You will give more and you will consume less, but you will not save more because you've already saved enough already. And yet, to some of you this morning, as I got into this topic, you're already doing this. And you have more money than the first 6 rows combined. And that's because you have learned how to give, but you've not been taught how to be generous. When we step into generosity, not only will we give more, save more, consume less, but Jesus makes a better promise than I can give you. Jesus promises you will be happier than you are right now. If we learn generosity, you will be happier than you are right now. Because I will guarantee this, you have never met an unhappy, generous person. Think about it. Have you ever met somebody that's, I'll give you money? No, generous people. You've never met an unhappy, in fact, it freaks you out that they seem thrilled to give stuff away. Like, what is wrong with you? I'm just giving everything away. Right? When I was in college in New York, Seinfeld kind of takes up on this in one of the episodes he does. There was a guy on TV called Crazy Eddie. Crazy Eddie was an appliance and electronics dealer. And so as I got into the series, I really wanted to replicate that, and then I realized none of you would know what I was talking about, except for a Seinfeld episode. So this is something new for a lot of us, not giving, but learning how to be generous. Now, the reason I have to teach you how to be generous is because generosity does not come naturally. And you know this if you're a parent, because you have never had to teach your kids the word mine. Right, parents? Have you ever had to teach your kids how to keep stuff to themselves? No, we have to actually teach our kids how to share. Because we're really good at mine. We're really good at holding stuff to ourselves. And even today, this is a big challenge they're facing this morning over in 321 Kids right now. Is kids are saying, mine! And we're trying, no, you need to share. You need to give that away. You know why? Generosity does not come naturally. Generosity is actually unnatural. Now, here's a plus for us. We get to live in the United States of America. And in the United States of America, although being generous may not be natural, it is cultural. And on some fronts today, it is fashionable. This began several years ago. Some of you know of Tom's Shoes. Tom's Shoes started to make it fashionable to be generous, which it really wasn't, because you're getting a pair of shoes, but you're giving it, we all kind of, kidded ourselves and be generous, like, well, I gave 2 pairs away to kids in Zimbabwe. It's just, we've almost made it we've made it fashionable in the United States to be generous, because everything has a cause it connects itself to. Now, listen, I'm not against that. I'm all for spontaneous, random giving, especially when it benefits other people, but that's not what I'm talking about. So although we live in the United States, it's not natural, but it can be cultural. And the reason why in places like the United States and Canada, in fact, in most Western countries, the reason why generosity is cultural is because of our Christian heritage. If you look back at any nation that has Christianity in its background, as its founding or heritage, you're going to find this leftover value of generosity. It's one of those things we know we should do. Right, as Americans, we know we should give, which is why when something happens on another part of the planet, the first nation to generally respond is the United States. We're the first one to put, Red Cross up on our screens. We're the first one to put causes up on our screen, and we give. And the reason I know that we are a culturally generous United States is if you look at other countries that do not have Christianity in their heritage, they are not generous. If you don't believe me, watch the news. Or go visit a country that does not have Christian heritage, because they are struggling in those countries in their infrastructure to support the poor, because they cannot get the people with the money to even give to their own people. It is an ongoing struggle in nations that do not have Christianity in its rearview mirror as part of its heritage, because it is not cultural. But thankfully, we live in the United States, and for the time being, it is cultural, and in some places, and sometimes it's actually fashionable. But I don't think we're practicing genuine generosity, because that does not come natural. You know what actually comes natural to us? When it comes to our money in the United States, crazy is what comes natural to us. Crazy comes naturally, particularly when it comes to our money. And let me just point out this statistic to prove that. Most Americans spend more than they make. That's crazy. In other parts of the world, that is unheard of. We actually outspend ourselves. In fact, not only that, but most Americans pay interest on stuff that decreases in value the minute we take ownership of it. I decided to put an illustration up here just so you'll understand what this looks like. So, Tim, let's put our illustration. This represents our point or moment of purchase. Okay, and for illustration's sake today, let's talk about a car, because the minute you buy a car, it immediately decreases in value the moment you drive it off the lot. Automatically, you just bought your new car. Ah! Yeah, and the minute you hit pavement that was not part of the car dealership, poof, the value drops. So here's what happens. The minute we buy something that over time is going to decrease in value, but you have financed it, right? Maybe through your credit card or maybe through GM or for financing. Here's what happens. The cost grows up, but the value goes down. Kids, this is crazy. But you know what? In the United States, this is normal. This is how the average American lives. And if you were to go to other countries, you know what they would look at you and go, "You're nuts." This is why we ride scooters everywhere, right? Because they understand that this is a crazy way to live. And yet I will bet, including myself, the majority of us in this room don't even think about this. That the minute we buy something, it begins to decrease, and we are paying more on something that's losing money every single day. We're throwing money away, and it's nuts. Here's something else that's absolutely crazy. You don't feel rich today, but you are. I know you're immediately going, "You don't know my checking account, my savings account, you know the bill." Listen. I know you don't feel rich, but you are. You feel generous, but you're not. You don't feel rich, but you are. You feel generous, but you're not. If you were to sit down today with somebody from a third world country, somebody from Tunisia or Pakistan or Vietnam or Nepal, if you were to sit down with one of these people and they were looking at all that you had, even if they just looked at what you are wearing right now, you know what they would say to you? You are rich. And that's because on the face of the planet right now, 2.1 billion people are living off of $3.10 or less a day. 2.1 billion people on the planet right now at this moment are living on less than $3.10 a day. So if you were to sit this person, they would look at you and say, "You're rich." You know what you would do? You would start to tell them about all the financial pressure you feel and the stress that you're under because of the bills you have to pay. And they'd look at you and go, "You're crazy. You're crazy. You don't think you're rich, but you are." We think we're generous, but as we're about to see, we really aren't. So I have to define what generous is, right? Because we're talking about generosity. You need to understand what it is to determine whether you are or whether you aren't. So before I tell you what generosity is, let me tell you what it isn't. Okay? If generosity isn't my spontaneous random giving, if generosity isn't I have something that I own and I give it away, if it's not that stuff, what is generosity? Well, I decided before I told you what it is, I should tell you what it's not. I wanted to dispel 4 myths about generosity. 4 things about generosity you may think are true, but are not. Myth number 1 we've already talked about, and that is that generosity is spontaneous. You see a need, you respond. You're watching TV and that ad comes up for St. Jude's Children's Hospital, which kills me every time. Right, so you see that ad and you immediately take out your wallet, you take out your debit card, your credit card, you write a check, you call the number, you make a donation. Or you see that GoFundMe page of that family that's in need and you respond to it. It's not what we're talking about here. That's spontaneous random giving. Again, I'm all for it, but what you're going to find over the course of the next couple of weeks is that genuinely generous people are far less spontaneous when it comes to their giving, and they're also far less emotional when it comes to their giving. They are actually far more strategic in their giving. So myth number 1, generosity is spontaneously giving. No, it's not. Myth number 2, generosity is determined by how much money you have. Like, Greg, I can be generous this weekend, but I can't be next weekend. Payday was Friday, so I'm good today, but don't ask me for anything next week. That somehow my act of being generous is determined by what's in my checking account, what's in my savings account, or how much debt I can incur on my credit card. That somehow there's a correlation between the two. And that's simply not true. What you're going to find today and over the course of next week is generous people are consistently generous, regardless of what's in their any account that they have. It's a way of living not just something that they do. So if you're here today and you're someone who only gives when you can afford to give and you don't give when you can't afford to give, you've probably learned how to give, which is okay, but you've not learned how to be generous, which is far better. Far better. So myth number 2, generosity is determined on how much money you have. Not true. Myth number 3, when it comes to generosity, is it's the amount that counts. It's the amount that counts. This one drives me crazy because I have been in what you would call professional ministry for 30 years. And every now and then in board meetings or governing board meetings, our treasurer would come and he would say to our team, we received a very generous financial gift this month. And not to sound ungrateful, but every now and then I wanted to raise my hand and say, how do we know it was generous? Just because it has more digits than what I could give does not mean it is generous. I think we kid ourselves sometimes into thinking we're generous by the amount that we give. Generosity has nothing to do with the amount that you give. I mean, the only person who knows whether that gift was truly a generous financial gift is the person who gave it, right? And maybe their accountant or their financial planner, if they have one. Adding zeros doesn't make it generous. If you want to find out what the level of generosity is, do it by percentage as opposed to amount. Because Jesus gave this great illustration of a woman who gave very little compared to a man who gave very much. And he said the woman actually gave more. We got to stop looking at generosity as being, well, it's the amount that you give. Generosity has nothing to do with that. Myth number 4. Myth number 4 is this. When it comes to generosity, rich people are generous. Let me make this really, really clear. Rich people are rich. Generous people are generous. Let me make that clear. Rich people are rich. Generous people are generous. There's no connection between the two. There is no correlation whatsoever. So here's how I can tell. If you are not generous now, when you finally make or attain enough money that's more than you'll ever want, you still will not be generous. You'll just be a rich person that's not generous. Does that make sense? If you aren't generous now, when you finally do make whatever that insane amount is you think you have to live on, we're going to talk more about this next week, you still won't be generous. You'll just be a rich person who hasn't learned to live generously. There is no correlation. Watch. Wealth is something you have or don't have. Generosity is something that you are. Wealth is something that you may or may not have. Generosity is something that you are. And what you are permeates then what you have. Some of the most generous people I know have next to nothing. And some of those selfish people I know have everything. And you know that because you know the same people. Generosity is not about how much money you have. Here's really good news for all of us today. Everyone can be generous. Who? Who? Are you sure? Everyone can be generous today. I know what you've done already by this point in the message. You've already dismissed yourself because you're in an immense amount of debt. You've already checked out because you know what your credit card statement is, you know what your banking account has, you know what's not in your savings account, and you've already stepped away because you've determined that generosity is based on your money, and we've already said that's not true. Generosity is not something that you have. It is something that you are. It is the heart of God. And what we're going to find today and over the course of the next 2 weeks is regardless of how much you have or don't have, everyone can be generous. So if that's what generosity isn't, then what is it? Well, let's go to our good friend dictionary.com, because that's always where I start. And so I did this week. I went to dictionary.com, and here's how dictionary.com defines generosity. Generosity is readiness or liberality in giving. Not really. That sounds a lot like spontaneous random giving. Like it's a readiness if I have it, and willingness if I'm able to be giving. So I don't like that definition, so I'm going to throw it out. Thankfully, I follow a really good leader named Andy Stanley. I was going to say pastor, but I'll do a little side message here real quick. It's unfortunate in the church we have taken a spiritual gift called pastoring and made it a title and a position. It's not. This is going to shock you. I do not have the gift of pastoring. My good friend Steve Babcock has far more gifts of pastoring than I have. But we did a disservice years and years ago in the church, and we took a spiritual gift, and we made it a title, and we said, you need to do it all because you're our pastor. I will just tell you, I have it in title. That's not my gifting. My gifting is in leadership, My gifting is in vision and mercy, but that's not my, so this is my little pet peeve right here. It's just kind of a clearing of the understanding. Some of you have far more gifts of pastoring than I have, and you know what you should be doing? You should be pastoring, because I'm not. What I mean by that is in the typical terminology that we've understood it by gifting. Does that make sense, by the way, to everybody? Some of you have to mull that through. Again, emails jeremyb@church321.com will explain what we mean. One of my favorite leaders to follow is pastor and author Andy Stanley. He wrecks my world every single time I listen to him. And I came across his definition of generosity, which messed me up in all kinds of good ways. It's not memorable, which is why it's not today's big idea. Today's big idea is everybody can be generous. I'm not sure I made that clear. Everybody can be generous. Here's his definition of generosity. Generosity is the premeditated, calculated, designated emancipation of personal financial assets. Everybody get this one down. Well, maybe we'll make it the big idea. No, you won't, because it's just way too many words. But here's why I like it. It is premeditated, meaning that generosity is thought about ahead of time. You have a plan when it comes to being generous. It is not spontaneous. It is not random. It is premeditated. Not only that, but it's calculated. I know how much I'm going to give, whether it's my money or whether it's my time. I've already calculated that. It's not a moment in time decision I'm making because of the need that comes to me. It is premeditated, it is calculated, it is designated. I already know where it's going to go. I already know where it's heading. I don't need the commercial to pop up on the TV. It is premeditated, it is calculated, it is designated, and I love this. It is emancipated. It is set free. And here's what I mean by that. Generous people understand that to not be owned by what they own, they have to have an approach and understanding that they never owned it to begin with. Does this make sense? Generous people understand that to not be owned by all the stuff I do own, I have to approach it that it's not mine to begin with. I don't own it. Generous people understand that in order to live their lives around generosity, they have to free themselves from their money. That in all honesty, when we free our money, we free ourselves from our money. And then that's why this topic is so tough for a lot of you, because you're not freed from your money, you're actually owned by your money. That's why it's an uncomfortable subject for all of us today. We don't approach it with positive terms. When we free our money, we free ourselves from our money. So generosity, what you need to hear today, generosity is not about income. Generosity is not about something you do, it's something that you are that results in your doing. It's about something that God is and that He wants us to be, which leads us to the most popular verse in the Bible about giving. It's a phrase every one of you have probably heard. Every one of you have probably spoke this phrase before. Some of you didn't even realize it was in the Bible, nor did you realize that Jesus is the one who said it. But I will guarantee all of you have heard this before. All of you have probably said it before. It is so familiar. Unfortunately, it's kind of become cliche. And when something becomes cliche, it loses its point. It loses its meaning. So before I get to the famous saying, which some of you already know, I want to set the scene up for you in which it's said. I want us to look at the New Testament book of Acts. Let me pause there. I want us to look at the New Testament historical document known as Acts. This was a document that was written long before the Bible was ever compiled. It's a document, it's a historical manuscript that was included when the New Testament would be put together and when eventually when the Bible would be compiled in about 270 A.D. Book was written somewhere before 70 A.D. And the book of Acts tells us about how this got started, how the church got started in the days and weeks and months after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. And in Acts chapter 9, we are introduced to a guy whose Hebrew name was Saul, but his Roman name was Paul, and that's how everybody remembers him. As Paul, we believe his Hebrew name was probably taken after the Old Testament king Saul, but his New Testament, his Roman name is how we remember him, Paul. Some of you remember that Paul, at one point, is this zealous Jewish religious leader who goes out to hunt down the church. And then in Acts chapter 9, he has a conversion experience where he becomes the spokesman for the entire movement just days before he was trying to wipe out. And then Paul's life is radically altered. He starts to travel all around the Mediterranean rim, planting these little ecclesias, these little gatherings and congregations of Jesus followers that they would brand Christians. These ecclesias would become known as unfortunately, churches, in a terrible travesty of misinterpretation, the ecclesia became church, which is actually a German word that doesn't refer to anything the ecclesia is talking about. But anyways, that's another message for another time. Paul starts these little gatherings, these communities of Christians or Jesus followers. A lot of them were made up of Jews and non-Jews. And so in the event we're about to step into, Paul's in the city of Ephesus, which if you were to visit today, you'd have to go to the westernmost part of the nation of Turkey, and you would find the remains of Ephesus. And here's what's happening. Paul's getting ready to go back to Jerusalem. And what Paul knows is the minute he sets foot inside the walls of Jerusalem, he will probably be arrested. There's been a warrant out for Paul's arrest ever since he left Jerusalem. And the warrant was put out by his former colleagues, the Jewish religious leaders that he served with. I mean, think about it. You wouldn't care. I don't like it when somebody goes from my favorite sports team and gets traded to the hated evil empire. Right? You don't either. That's what's happening here. The Jewish religious leaders hated the fact that Paul was no longer one of them. He's one of them. So Paul knows the minute he comes back into Jerusalem, he will be arrested, and most likely he will be executed for being a follower of Jesus. So he's getting ready to say his goodbye. It's a very emotional moment that we're about to look at. It's emotional for Paul. It's emotional for the people in Ephesus, for the church. They are begging Paul not to go. And without bragging, Paul kind of turns to them in Acts chapter 20, and he says this, I have lived a generous life. This is something God has called me to be and to do. I have lived a generous life, and I want you to live a generous life as well. And then he reminds them of this statement that again, has become so familiar to us and would have been so familiar to them. But unlike us, where it's become cliche, they understood exactly what Jesus meant when he said this. Paul's getting ready to get on the boat to travel 600 miles away back to Jerusalem. He turns to them and he says these words, remember the words of our Lord Jesus. In other words, this is not new information. Not the first time you're hearing this. You've been told this before. You need to remember the words of the Lord Jesus. It is more blessed to give than to receive. Or you grew up in church, it is more blessed to give. I don't know why we made that a two-syllable word when it is not, but we did. It is more blessed to give than to receive. Now, the last time you said these words were when you gave something to somebody. And in order to feel more humble about yourself, you said to them when their eyes, well, it actually benefits me more than you because it's more blessed to give than to receive. Or maybe you got something and the person on the other end, when you felt sort of embarrassed by the fact that you were being given something, they said to you these words. But when Jesus originally said this, when Jesus said these words, he did not have a moment in time transaction in his mind. He wasn't thinking event. Jesus was talking about a way of living life. Not just about a way to do things, a way to be things. Jesus did not have in mind that time you gave somebody that check, that time you made that donation, that time you went and did. That's not what Jesus is talking about. That's spontaneous random acts of giving. All four of that, not what he's talking about. Jesus is talking about a way of life. And the reason we know that is because when we hear those words, some of us who are really honest would sit and go, yeah, but it's really good to get to. Like, I get it, Jesus, yeah, it is really good to give, but it's really good to get. Like, Jesus, I know what you're saying, but I think they're equal. Like, it's really good to get. Jesus is going, that's because you're thinking about a moment in time, event, or transaction. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a heart condition that results in a way of living. All right, so who's ready for our weekly Greek word study? You fakers. You're just doing this to make me feel good. Okay, let's look at what the original Greek has to say because Acts was written in Koine Greek. The original Greek word for blessed or blessed is this word right here, makarion. It comes from the root word makarios, which we have seen before. If you were with us last spring, we did a series of messages called Happy. Anybody remember the giant? Thank you. 2 of you remember this series. That's excellent. It means I can do it next month and none of you will remember that I said this. The word happy actually comes from the word makarios. Makarios means happy. And what we saw in our series Happy, because I know you all remember the big idea from last spring, is that we sow or we plant and reap our way to happiness. That's what we saw in our series last spring. That happiness is the result of a way of living. It's the outcome of a lifestyle. Paul says, when he references these words of Jesus, if you will live a generous life, not just impulsively give when you feel the need, if you will live a generous life, watch, you'll be happy. That happy is the person whose life, not just these moment in time transactions, whose life is centered, whose heart is centered on giving rather than receiving. Happy is the person whose life is centered on giving rather than receiving. Now, let me say this here because I don't want you to miss the point of this morning or the entire series. These 3 weeks are not an attempt for me to get something from you. You're not going to come in next week and there's going to be a pledge card on your seat. This isn't like we're trying to boost our capital campaign, and we aren't going to jump into another campaign for giving. I will tell you that we have already started talks on a larger auditorium. You will be hearing about that because when everybody decides to come back from vacation, we can no longer handle the amount of people on a Sunday morning through 3 services. We know we can't go to 4. We have a very bad, good problem. We've run out of space in the inn. And because we are for people and we are for Sylvania especially, we know we have to create more room, but today is not about that. Today is not me trying to get you to do something. I'm trying to get you to be something. If I wanted to get you to do something, it'd be real easy. We'd go over to 321 Kids, and we'd find a kid that's over there that looks like they haven't eaten in a week. We'd put their picture up here, and then I'd bring the band back up, and they start playing around. They'd be up here on an acoustic guitar, playing something really soft, like by Guns N' Roses, like Every Thorn Has a Crow. I don't know. And then we'd soften the lights, we'd play something, and then somebody like me, would stand up here, and we'd try to persuade you, or most often in the church, we guilt you into giving. If I wanted something from you, we would have programmed that this morning. But here's the other thing I know. Most of the time, that doesn't work. We've actually all become numb to half of the commercials that are on TV. You know what happens the next time St. Jude's comes up. You do what I do, click. Now, I click it for completely different reasons, and some of you know that story, but we click. I don't want something from you. I want something so much better. I want something for you today. This is great. I'm not asking something from you. I actually want to give something to you. I want us to learn how to be generous. So as I wrap up here, I want us to use our imagination. That is for, thank you, Spencer, you're laughing, because it's a SpongeBob, and the only people that will understand it are those who are 25 years of younger, or those of us who are parents who watch SpongeBob with our kids. Remember? Everybody remember this is a rainbow when SpongeBob goes, I am in my own world up here, and you are just along for the ride. I want you to use your imagination for a second. Okay, everybody ready to use your imagination? All right, yes. Okay, here's what I want you to imagine. This is going to be a great thing. I want you to imagine for a second that you are given a checking account right now of all the money you've wasted over the last 10 years. Now, stop. I'm not going to tell you what you wasted on because I don't want to offend any of you. I know what I've wasted my money on. My wife could tell you what I've wasted my money on because I am the spender in our family, not the saver. Please, right now, no elbows to the rib cage. Guys, do not stare at her shoes or purse. None of that. This is just isolate yourself in your own little world. I want you to imagine that right now, you have just been given a checking account that is full of all the money that you would consider wasted over the last 10 years. Here's the challenge. You have 365 days to give it away. It is not yours. You don't own it. It is yours to manage. You do not have to give it away at one time or immediately. You can parcel it out over time, but you have 365 days to empty your account. 365 days. Now, let me tell you something. That would be fun. Would it not be fun? You're not sure. Because you're thinking about all the ways you can spend it on you. We're going to talk about this next week. We're going to talk next week about the consumption assumption, which most Americans have. I will tell you that the minute you see that GoFundMe page and you're able to say, I can give to that, you will not feel possessive of your money. When you hear about your school getting ready to try and launch a building program or they need money for a program, you will not be regretful. You'll actually write the check and be like, I can do that. I can do that. I can see St. Jude's and give to it. You will actually feel grateful. You will experience the joy of generosity because you're not going to be bound by your money. It has no impact on you. You can't use it on yourself. We'll experience generosity. So here's my question to you. Why not start today? Because generosity is not about how much you have or don't have right now. Truthfully, generosity is not even about your money. Generosity is about your heart today. It's about your willingness to let your neighbor use or not use your weed whacker. It's about my willingness to let my wife use my car. She's speaking in week 3. I won't get to that level of generosity. I've not attained that level yet, but I'm not talking about your money today. God's talking about our heart. He wants to follow us into his heart. And he tells you today that when you become generous, you will give more, save more, and you will consume less. Here's really great news. The younger you are, the better chance you have of getting this right now. Because I'll tell you, there's a lot of people in or around my age that wish we could go back and make better financial decisions. There are people my age in this room right now that would love to have back all the money that we've wasted over the last 10 years, even if we couldn't spend it on ourselves. The younger you are, the better chance you have of living generously now. But here's the other thing. Everyone can be generous. 5 years old, 15, well, 5 might be a stretch, but 15 years old, 25, 85, 95, every one of us today can be generous because it starts with a heart. And that's where God wants to lead us. And when we become generous, we will give more, we will save more, and we will consume less. But better yet, you'll be happier. Anybody ready for another level of happiness? Nobody. 5 of us in the room are ready for happiness. The rest of you are going on vacation for the next 2 weeks. So, get it? Let's pray. Father, I really do pray today that what we see is your heart. I pray it's not clouded by dollars and cents and checking accounts and savings accounts and what my IRA may or may not have, what my banking account, how much I have in my pocket right now, how much consumer debt I have. Just help us to push that all aside. That's not what you're pushing into us about. You really don't want our money today. You want our hearts. You want us to live differently. And I'm very, very grateful that we know how to give. But God, I pray that we will be generous. I pray that one of the chief things 321 becomes known for is we are generous. I mean, we've already allowed churches to use our building that have started, that other churches would see as rivals. We've just said, we don't see it that way. We're all about the church. And so we've had churches in here that are starting. We've given money to other churches that are starting. And I pray that generosity is something that we are, that when other people look at us, not just individually, but as a corporate church at 321, they'll just say, that church is just freaked out generous, man. I don't know how they can do or what they do, but they are just generous. They have a generous heart. That we won't be owned by what we own because we understand, God, that everything we sit in right now, everything we sit on right now, the property, it is a gift from you. It is something we are just called to manage. And as easily as it has been given to us, it can be taken away. God, help us follow your heart into what it means and looks like to be generous. And help us to continually respond to needs. But God, help us see your heart and follow your heart. And I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, a real practical way that we can be generous is that we have partnered with Sylvania Area Family Services, and we are collecting backpacks for the kids of Sylvania. We're not asking you to fill them, but just to have a new, clean backpack. Believe it or not, July 15th, school supplies are out in stores. Next week, there will be Christmas. But anyways, until then, so grab a backpack before you're getting your Christmas socks. But bring those back here in our welcome area. We will have a collection place for backpacks. There you go. Also, because we are in Sylvania and we are for Sylvania, next weekend or this coming weekend is Pizza Palooza, which is right over here at Centennial Terrace. It could be a great opportunity for you with your life groups. You get to eat a lot of great pizza and mingle around with people, but that's next weekend. You can look at the Centennial Terrace website and get more details there. If you are with us for the first time, welcome. We are so glad that you are here. We would love to connect with you. If you would be willing to take a moment as you walk out these doors and head to your left at our welcome area, you can fill out a guest card, and then we will give you a free Church 321 mug as a way of saying thank you. If you did bring a generous gift to give, we have boxes on both sides of the walls as you leave, or we encourage you to give online through our website at church321.com. So remember today, everyone can be generous, and that includes you, and that includes me. Ask God, continue to challenge my heart to live generously, teach me what that is, and live a generous life. Have a great day, and we will see you all next week.